one of the things I want to start with is this question of Beethoven, because as people may have asked when they heard Lyndon LaRouche in his discussion with Harley that we just listened to, well, I thought LaRouche was a politician or an economist. So what is he doing? Why does he have all these ideas about Beethoven? Now, interestingly, the principal violinist of the Amadeus String Quartet, Norbert Breining, who was a dear friend of Lyndon LaRouche, said that Lynn was someone who knew more about music than he did, and one of the people that he finally felt could understand his insights into certain musical compositional principles, like the question of the Motivführung, uh, development in the whole. So on that question, Beethoven, I don't think it's arbitrary. That is, people who love mankind want to do things that are beautiful, that uplift mankind. And I have a few quotes from Beethoven today, but I'm just going to read you one thing. I found it somewhat amusing. Of course, he had to deal with the horrors of Napoleon and a kind of a fascist control in Europe, not just uh, the royal system of royalty and your future is basically what bloodline you're born into, but actual oppression, troops in the streets, and so on. At one point, he writes, here, various important people have been locked up. It is said that a revolution is about to break out. But I believe that so long as an Austrian can get his brown ale and his little sausages, he is not likely to revolt. So, a very astute political insight from Ludwig van Beethoven, who people thought um, was just a composer, okay, and musician, and I would say universal genius. And I'll have more in a second. What we took up on the fourth panel, which heard a keynote from Jacques Cheminade, who is a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche in France, who's run for president of France 3 times and is the head of a party there, Solidarité et Progrès. He raised the question, and Helga took it up in a different way, which is, how is it that you can have a population which is so advanced? I mean, this is me speaking now, but we're going to have China, the UAE, and the United States all landing various landers and rovers and experimental instruments on the surface of Mars. They're all going to arrive there in February of 2021. So given that we have that level of scientific advancement, how could it be that we have 260 million people on the planet who are threatened with death by starvation? Is starvation something that is that hard to deal with? Or how could it be that we've had nearly 1.7 million people die of the coronavirus when we actually have the capacity to be getting to Mars in this way? And Helga took this up from another standpoint, talking about the people that she had observed who really developed to become beautiful souls were in almost every case touched by a beautiful soul, a universal genius of perhaps a previous generation, either a teacher, someone they knew, or I think in some cases people you may not know personally, but you know their mind, the way that Lyndon LaRouche, by a very early age, got to know the mind of Leibniz, for example, or Helga described the impact of Schiller on her as a young girl, and that this becomes part of your identity so that you actually address this. And I really just would encourage people to watch this fourth panel, because it was a dialogue between Helga, Jacques, and a group of young people who are constituting an international youth movement all over the planet, taking up various interesting discussions. One of the things during the panel that evoked the most controversy was a question about chess, which I think gets at what Lynn was saying earlier about how you can have all the notes right, but the music is missing. The music is wrong. The performance is wrong, even if it's technically perfect. Because what is it that distinguishes actual creativity? Now, on that, I wanted to share with you from Beethoven, again, how he thought about this and how connected he was to the world, to the fate of mankind, even as his art, in a sense, was connected to something definitely not in the physical domain. He writes, "You know yourself that a man's spirit, the active creative spirit, must not be tied down to the wretched necessities of life. And this business robs me of many other things conducive to a happy existence. I have been compelled, and still am compelled, to set bounds to my inclination, nay more, to the duty which I had imposed on myself, i.e., to work by means of my art for human beings in distress. I shall not say anything to you about our monarchs and so forth, or about our monarchies and so forth, for the papers report everything to you." And then later, he says, "Before my departure for the Elysian fields, I must leave behind me what the eternal spirit has infused into my soul and bids me complete. Why, I feel as if I hardly composed more than a few notes. I wish you every success in your efforts on behalf of art, for after all, only art and science give us intimations and hopes of a higher life." So it it was not some fluke, which is what the Congress of Cultural Freedom and people committed to imposing a dark age upon us, that Beethoven composed the music that he composed. He was driven by a sense of necessity to uplift mankind and therefore to fight for a certain degree of perfection in what he was producing. Now, I want to share with you something from Lyndon LaRouche, and people have seen or hopefully will order this book of LaRouche's writings, Think Like Beethoven, where he says, and this is actually from May of 1977, LaRouche writes, "There are no unreachable summits for man, since everything in existence conforms to the lawful ordering of the universe. There is always a method and a path which lead efficiently to the summit of the Everests of all kinds. These possibilities are mainly matters of technology and knowledge. What we are able to do is limited by the progress of our technology. Whether we can successfully achieve what available technology implies is a matter of knowing the appropriate path and mustering the enduring determination to follow that course. On these very premises, we may regard human colonies on Mars as a task of the century beginning about 1990 to 95. You can see we've lost a great deal of time on this. For the same reason, the mastery of Beethoven is something we should have been capable of effecting before this. Beethoven was a product of the same European culture that produced our American Revolution and established our republic." So if you think of the United States, of our republic, in the way that Lyndon LaRouche conceived of it and Beethoven, then obviously there's a much higher standard to which we must hold ourselves, and a standard which is tied to the question of the general welfare of mankind as a whole, as a universal principle. And what Helga brought into this panel is, aside from that discussion, she referenced what Schiller describes as a difference between a savage and a barbarian. That is, a savage is a person who perhaps never knew more advanced culture, never had a higher standard of living, someone in some Aboriginal tribe stuck somewhere. But Mr. LaRouche would argue that even many of these cultures were actually a result of some kind of collapse imposed on someone that was progressing. But a barbarian, and what we find much more offensive, and you can think about it among people that you know, what's much more offensive is someone who has attained a certain degree of culture, of literacy, of standard of living, and then they behave like a disgusting pig. And that is something that really gets at you. It's the most kind of ugly thing imaginable. And that sort of a question is, how do you, if you have a society that seems relatively quote unquote advanced, how do you transform people from their barbaric state into becoming civilized human beings? And I think part of that really is this question of agape, as we hear in Beethoven, that you develop a love, the love of God, the love of mankind, the love of truth, the love of beauty. Because when you love in that way, it's active. It's not something where you're thinking about yourself. Shakespeare comes to mind, but thou contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame on self-substantial fuel. That is, this selfishness where you consume yourself, versus as you love in this agapic sense, then you become actually a very big person, a universal person. A nation based on those principles is a nation which can bring a certain quality of nobility and dignity to the planet. So, as was said earlier, in 2014, about this time of year, we organized a sing-along of Handel's Messiah in response to actually the grand jury decision in the Garner case that no crime had been committed in the death by strangulation of Eric Garner at the hands of the police in Staten Island. And fear that what would be done by the news media, which is always trying to foment division and rage and anger, is some kind of crazy response where you get people mobilized against each other who really wouldn't be against each other. In this case, the police department and the African American community, or however you want to look at it. Because when actually, if you look at the background of who's in the NYPD and the people whose lives they're protecting, or the life of Eric Garner and his background, in many cases, it's not that different. So why should these people be adversaries? There's a higher principle which you have to get at. So we said every single human life is sacred. We organized this sing-along of the Messiah. Tragically, the very day we had the sing-along, 2 police officers were shot to death as they sat in their car. So from some guy who came up from Maryland. But at any rate, the idea was to avoid this, to take it to a higher level. And what happened is about 100 people showed up on 6 days' notice to sing. And we said, let's organize a chorus. The Schiller Institute, as you heard from LaRouche, had been working for a long time under the direction of John Segerson. We had performed back on the 50th anniversary, 2013, of the Kennedy assassination, the Mozart Requiem, that November, and then in January in Boston. And we began to pull this project together in New York. And what became very clear is there was such a need for it. And there is no stereotypical person who joined this chorus. It was completely diverse in terms of age, background, musical training, you name it. But people came together to work on beautiful music. Now, we had decided that this year, being the 250th anniversary of the birth of Beethoven, to actually tackle something which John had discussed on a number of occasions with Lyndon LaRouche, but which is an extremely challenging work for chorus, Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, which people who know it, it's about 90 minutes long. The chorus, which premiered it, was an extraordinary chorus in St. Petersburg. And here we are, a community chorus with every, as I said, all different range of capabilities. And if you know music, if I tell you the ranges of the voices are extreme, that you have basses singing high notes of the tenors, sopranos singing high notes for many long durations. It's a challenge, to say the least. But we decided to tackle it. And then in the midst of that, all of a sudden, COVID-19 hits, and you say, well, now what do we do? Here we're trying to tackle one of the most challenging choral works ever written, and we can't even get together in the same room to rehearse. So we decided to try and take advantage of this Zoom technology to conduct rehearsals and learn this with the intent that when mankind comes through this hideous period that we are in right now, we will definitely be in need of a celebratory mass dedicated really to the dignity of mankind. And what more appropriate thing to do than the Missa Solemnis at that occasion, and that we would not abandon this. But for people who know, since we don't have 5G, we haven't quite developed excellent systems of communication between the US and Mars so far. You have varying internet speeds, so there's no possible way, it's physically impossible in a rehearsal over the internet for the conductor to ask everybody to sing and then have everyone unmute themselves and you hear people singing at the same time. Does not work. And you can try it at home. Does not work. So talk about, I guess it's a challenge like Beethoven had, being deaf. The conductor has to lead a rehearsal throughout which he never gets to hear how people are singing. People remain muted, each in their own living room, singing their part. And it's kind of an act of faith and a mental exercise to imagine what's going to be challenging for people and to try and learn the parts. So it's been very interesting, to say the least. And then to put together a recording, as I'm going to play just a snip of the beginning of it for you so you have a sense of it. You find yourself you're forced to do all the things that you say music is not. For example, no two performances of a classical work of art will ever be identical because it's alive, because there are so many different elements. It's being performed by a few hundred human beings. Each of us is not even the same as we were 5 seconds ago, let alone a month ago or a year ago. So already it's of necessity going to be different. But in this medium, to do a recording like what you see, everybody has to listen to the same track, which is pre-recorded. We even use what's known as a click track, where you have metronomic beats. And Furtwängler and others said, well, about Toscanelli, he's just a beater of time. You never want to perform that way. But of necessity, to be able to have the chorus be coherent, you have to do this. I think this is definitely an example of a coincidence of opposites, or a paradox. But submitting ourselves to all of that difficulty, we did a number of so-called virtual performances, and actually, I think something human comes across. John did a brilliant job in creating an orchestra, which is not even a real orchestra. It's a synthesized orchestra. So all of these things that you would say are terrible and you should never do this, because of the situation we found ourselves in and our efforts to make headway in at least having a glimmer of an insight into this extraordinary work, we did. So with that, I think we're just going to hear a couple minutes of the beginning of this piece, and you can find more on the Schiller Institute Chorus website, which is sinycchorus.com. But if we could hear the Kyrie for a minute now. So I'll just leave you with that. I think that what makes you want to listen to a lot more. And I would say that I had a thought the other day, which is I have come to disagree with this saying that everyone says so much, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think that the intention is primary. If you have the right intention, even if you are forced to use methods which you find are not the best or appropriate or would be wrong in another circumstance, it's the intention which is what allows you to get done what is necessary.